My name is Garvey Ellis, and I am 76 years old. I've spent nearly 5 decades of my life teaching American history to teenagers who, more often than not, would rather be anywhere else than in a classroom. But I loved it, every minute of it. I loved the creak of the chalkboard, the dusty smell of old textbooks, the raised hands, the arguments about the Civil War or Reconstruction, and even the awkward silences when no one remembered the name of a founding father. It made me feel useful, anchored. My wife, Lorna, used to say that I was married to my job even before I was married to her. We met in 1971 at a community fundraiser in Chestnut Hill. She brought cookies. I brought a diorama of the Battle of Bunker Hill. She laughed at me and said I looked like a nervous preacher. I wasn't, but I was smitten. A year later, we were married. We had one son, Justin. He was a quiet boy, brilliant but inward, who grew up in a house filled with books and stories. Lorna was the warmth of the home. I was its voice. We lived in a modest house in the suburbs until 1993, when I came into a small inheritance from my aunt, a reclusive woman who had lived in Vermont with 15 cats and a pension she never touched. Lorna and I decided to build a home, not just a house, a real family home, a place where holidays would echo with laughter, where our future grandchildren would run barefoot across hardwood floors. I oversaw every detail of the construction. I chose the red brick exterior, the stained glass panels for the vestibule, the stone fireplace. Lorna designed the kitchen and garden. We built it on a quiet corner lot just outside Philadelphia, a modest mansion by modern standards. But to us, it was a fortress of memory and belonging. I lived in that house with Lorna for 25 years. We hosted Thanksgivings that bordered on chaotic. We had birthdays and anniversaries. We played Scrabble on rainy days and argued over paint colors and politics. We buried our dog, Scout, under the old oak tree in the backyard. Then, 5 years ago, Lorna died. A stroke in the middle of the night. 1 minute she was breathing beside me, the next she wasn't. And just like that, silence became permanent. It wasn't just her absence that changed the house. It was how it absorbed it, how the rooms echoed differently. The refrigerator hummed louder. The wood floors creaked more. The air felt colder. Justin came by less and less after her death. He had his own family, his own work, something in real estate consulting that I never quite understood. His wife, Molly, was polite at first, then less so. She had a clipped way of speaking to me like every conversation was a chore. They lived in the city, in a rental apartment, with 2 small bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and were constantly complaining about the noise, the traffic, the rent. When they asked if they could move into the house, into my house, I didn't hesitate. This house was built for family, I said. It's too big for one man. They moved in within a month. I offered them the master bedroom, though it still smelled like Lorna's lavender lotion, and I moved into the old guest room near the back of the house. It was small, windowless, and dry. Molly called it the annex, with a smirk that she didn't try to hide. I didn't care. I was glad to have people around. The laughter of my 2 grandchildren, Alec and Faith, brought some life back into the hollowed spaces. For a while I believed we were healing, but things change slowly, and then all at once. Molly began reordering the house as if I were a temporary tenant. My books disappeared from the living room shelves. The framed photos of Lorna were replaced with pastel motivational quotes in Target frames. She said she was trying to freshen up the space. Then came the new locks, first on the laundry room door, then the pantry, then, eventually, the thermostat. I found myself asking permission to use my own microwave. My pension, which was modest but steady, was redirected into a shared family account. Molly insisted it was more convenient that way. Justin didn't object. They told their friends and neighbors that they had taken in Justin's aging father, that they were doing their best to accommodate him. I was introduced at gatherings as Pop, like a mascot, something quaint and pitiable. Molly would laugh loudly and say things like, "We've got the full multi-generational setup. It's like having a sitcom character in the house." Once, during dinner, I tried to explain a small discrepancy in a historical documentary we were watching, one detail about Reconstruction politics, and Molly turned to me and said, "Garvey, it's not that serious. Can't you just enjoy things like normal people?" That was when I realized I wasn't part of this household. I was furniture, old and inconvenient, something you learn to walk around but never look at too closely. The children stopped sitting with me. They were growing, of course, and teenagers have their own world, but it was more than that. Alec once asked me if I had dementia because, as he claimed, "You always repeat stories." Faith refused to ride with me in the car to church, saying she didn't like the smell of the upholstery. Molly would schedule their family vacations without telling me, leaving me alone in the house for a week at a time. I didn't mind being alone. What I minded was the slow erasure, the disconnection. The feeling that I was becoming invisible in the very place I had poured my life into. The final straw came on a Wednesday morning in April. I had risen early, as always, and was boiling water for tea. Molly came downstairs in her yoga outfit, earbuds in, and opened the refrigerator. She sighed, slammed it shut, and turned to me. "There's no oat milk," she snapped. "Again." "I don't drink oat milk," I replied gently, "but I can pick some up today." She stared at me, hands on her hips, and then said the words I would never forget. "You should be grateful for any roof over your head, Garvey. Some people your age are in nursing homes. You don't get to make demands here." She walked out of the room before I could answer. I stood there, tea kettle whistling, the steam fogging up my glasses, and I realized something. I had become a ghost in my own home. The house I had built, paid for, maintained. The walls that held my memories now held me captive, and I was supposed to be grateful. That morning, for the first time in my life, I sat down and made a list of everything I still owned, everything still in my name. I made tea, drank it slowly, and stared out the kitchen window. The tulips were blooming. Lorna's tulips. I remembered how we planted them together the first spring we moved in, how she insisted on alternating colors even when I said it didn't matter. She always said beauty mattered, order mattered, dignity mattered. And I realized I had lost all three, but not forever. Not yet. The morning after Molly's comment settled into my bones like winter damp in an old house, I woke up with an odd clarity. Not anger. No. That had long since calcified into something quieter, something slower and heavier. It was more like a quiet click in my mind, as if something finally lined up, like a gear that had been misaligned for years, snapping into place. I brewed my tea and sat at the kitchen table, the one Molly had ordered custom and which she complained I scratched with my old man elbows. The smell of lemon disinfectant clung to every surface, harsh and unnatural, masking the warm cedar tones of the wood paneling Lorna and I had chosen. I remembered when this room smelled like cinnamon and cloves during December, when Faith and Alec helped Lorna roll out dough for gingerbread cookies, and she would hum softly under her breath. A tune from her mother, she'd said. Now the house felt sterile and sharp, every corner occupied by objects that didn't belong to me. A minimalist clock with no numbers, a teal ceramic fruit bowl with fake lemons, framed quotes like "good vibes only" and "gratitude is the attitude," hanging where our wedding photo used to be. That day, as I sipped my tea, Molly breezed in wearing a long cardigan and faux designer slippers, scrolling through her phone. She didn't acknowledge me at first. Hadn't for months without being prompted. I watched her fingers dart across the screen, her brows furrowed. Then, without looking up, she said, "You've got that doctor's appointment next Thursday, right?" I blinked. "Doctor's appointment?" She looked at me finally, mildly annoyed. "Justin said you needed to see someone about your memory. You've been forgetting things. The stove, the thermostat, where your shoes are. Remember when you left the door open all night?" I stared at her. I had never left the door open all night. I hadn't even touched the thermostat in over a year because they had set it to eco mode and password protected it. "I don't recall making that appointment," I said calmly. Molly smirked. "Exactly." She left without further explanation, leaving a bitter aftertaste in the air heavier than the tea I hadn't finished. Later that evening, I overheard her talking to Justin on speakerphone in the living room. They assumed I was asleep because I had the habit of retiring early. "He's getting worse," Molly whispered, voice low but tense. "He stared at the toaster for 10 minutes this morning. Just stood there like he forgot what it was." Justin sighed. "Maybe it's time we start the process. You know, power of attorney. It'll make things easier." "You mean legal control?" Molly replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "If he goes into memory care, we'll need access. He's got that pension, plus Social Security. And the house, of course." There was a long pause. "You think he'll resist?" "He won't understand. He doesn't know what day it is half the time." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart thudding not with fear but with fury. They weren't just reshaping the house. I could survive that. They were now reshaping me, narrating a version of my life where I was incapable, absent, dissolving. And the worst part was, they were saying it so casually, like it was just paperwork, like I was paperwork. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my small room, the one that used to be the crafts room before Molly stripped it of Lorna's knitting and turned it into what she called the annex. I sat in my armchair, the one thing they hadn't touched because it was too heavy to move, and stared at the ceiling fan spinning in slow, ghostly circles. The next morning I found the attic key. It had been buried in the drawer of Lorna's old sewing cabinet, which Molly kept saying we needed to donate to charity because it didn't fit the aesthetic. I climbed the attic stairs, careful not to creak too loudly, and opened the narrow door. The air was dry and smelled of dust and cardboard. Boxes lined every wall, decades of our lives tucked away. And then, wedged between a stack of Christmas decorations and a bundle of yellowing yearbooks, I found the fireproof safe. Lorna had insisted we buy one in the 90s after a friend's house burned down. "Just in case," she said. We stored important things there: wills, birth certificates, our marriage license, and most importantly, the deed to the house. With trembling fingers, I turned the combination lock. I remembered it immediately. Her birthday, my birthday, the year we married. The safe clicked open. Inside, neatly stacked, were manila folders. I pulled out the one labeled Ellis Residence. I sat on the attic floor, legs crossed like a schoolboy, and read slowly, methodically. And there it was, clear as day, signed and notarized in 1995, a living trust agreement. It stated that I, Garvey Ellis, was the sole original owner and trustee of the house, and that should any family members reside there, their occupancy would be considered provisional unless otherwise amended by me. The trust had never been amended. My breath caught. They had no legal right to the house, no power, no claim. Justin may have paid for a new roof 5 years ago. Molly might have ordered furniture and painted walls. But none of that mattered. The house was mine. The place I had built brick by brick, The place I had shared with my wife. The place I had allowed them to enter out of love, not obligation. And here they were, preparing to push me out, to declare me unfit, and perhaps institutionalize me, erase me like one of Molly's throw pillows that didn't match the couch. I sat in the attic for over an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. Instead, I felt an icy resolve form in my chest. It was like watching the tide pull back before a storm. I took the deed, carefully placed it in a new envelope, and slid it into my coat pocket. I went back downstairs, passing Justin on his way in from the garage. He didn't notice the envelope. He was too busy scrolling through his email. "Hey, Dad," he muttered. "Don't forget we've got a family meeting Sunday night. Molly wants to talk about next steps." I smiled gently and nodded. "Of course," I said. "I'll be there." Sunday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the next 2 days photocopying documents at the public library and visiting a lawyer I knew from my teaching days. An old friend of Lorna's, actually. He was semi-retired, slow to speak, but sharp as ever. When I placed the trust agreement in front of him, his eyes narrowed. "They have no idea this exists?" he asked. "None," I replied. "They think I'm too far gone to tie my own shoes." He chuckled grimly. "Well, Garvey, I think it's time we remind them who they're dealing with." And so it began. A quiet war. A war not of shouting or slammed doors, but of paper, ink, and memory. Of reclaiming what was mine before they wrote me out of my own story. The house was never just a house. It was everything we had worked for, Lorna and I. And now it was being hollowed out by people who saw me as a burden instead of a man. Let them have their oat milk and faux smiles. I had something better. I had the truth. And I was no longer afraid to use it. The first signs of retaliation from Justin and Molly weren't dramatic. That would have made things easier, more obvious. Something to point to and say, "See? Look what they're doing." No, what they did was slower, more deliberate, coated in the sticky veneer of plausible deniability. It began the week after the family meeting, which, unsurprisingly, was not a meeting but rather a monologue delivered by Molly, flanked by Justin, who sat on the couch like a silent partner in a real estate firm, nodding whenever she looked in his direction. She presented a list of recommendations from an elder care consultant she'd apparently spoken with, without ever discussing it with me. "They say it's important to maintain structure for seniors," she began, as if I were already halfway to being nonverbal. "So we've drawn up some basic house rules, not restrictions, just rhythms to help you feel more supported." I glanced down at the typed list she handed me. Shared kitchen use will be limited to off-peak hours for safety reasons. No unaccompanied use of the laundry room due to past confusion with detergent settings. All medication to be stored in the lockbox. Access granted daily. Thermostat. Requests must be made through Justin. Noise curfew, 9 p.m. And then, the final line. We reserve the right to revisit this arrangement should these protocols prove ineffective. I looked up from the paper and said nothing. Molly smiled brightly, as if she had just gifted me a weekend spa getaway. "It's just temporary, Garvey. Until we see improvements. Everyone needs a little help now and then." Justin didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he fiddled with the hem of his shirt and nodded once, mechanically. I folded the paper in half, placed it on the armrest of my chair, and excused myself. That night, the laundry room door was fitted with a keypad lock. Justin said it was a precaution because Alec had left the dryer running and nearly started a fire. Alec later admitted that wasn't true. He hadn't done laundry in weeks. The next day, I tried to open the garage where my tools were kept, only to find the lock changed. "Insurance issues?" Molly explained vaguely. "There's a liability risk if something happens." I asked her what exactly she thought would happen if I used my own screwdriver. She shrugged and said, "It's not about you, Garvey. It's about policies. You'd understand if you weren't so—" She stopped short and looked away, pretending to be distracted by a text message. 3 days later, I woke up and went to make toast, only to find the bread and peanut butter missing from the pantry. Molly claimed we were simplifying the food inventory. "Too many items going stale," she said. "It's wasteful." From then on, the pantry was locked with a chain latch. Molly handed me a little canvas sack with a few labeled food items, instant oatmeal, canned pears, crackers, and said, "This is your shelf now. Let us know if you run out." I stood in that kitchen, staring at her. Her manicured hand rested on the counter, her wedding band glinting under the fluorescent light I had installed myself 25 years ago. I wanted to scream, but instead I nodded and said, "Thank you." The isolation deepened incrementally, like watching slow erosion. My mail was rerouted. When I asked about it, Justin said they had opted into digital delivery to simplify things. My magazine subscriptions stopped arriving. My phone rang less. Then, not at all. When I checked, I saw that voicemail had been deactivated and the call log was empty. Molly told me that telemarketers were clogging the line. And it was for everyone's peace of mind. When I mentioned that Lorna's cousin Clara had been calling every month for years, Molly said, "She can email." Then came the visitors. Or rather, the lack of them. My former colleagues, old friends from church, even the handyman I'd known for a decade. None of them came around anymore. At first, I thought it was natural drift. People grow busy, distracted. But when I called my friend Charles, his wife answered. "Oh, Garvey," she said, hesitating. "We tried visiting last week, but Molly said you weren't feeling well and didn't want to be disturbed. I'm sorry. We didn't mean to overstep." My stomach dropped. I hadn't been sick. I hadn't even known they'd come by. I asked her to please try again. They never did. I started walking to the park every morning, just to breathe air that wasn't tinged with resentment. I'd sit on the same bench, watch the ducks, feed them crusts from the stale bread Molly deemed expired, and think. I thought about Lorna's laugh, the way she used to hum when she cooked. I thought about how the sun used to hit the dining room table just right in the mornings, and how Faith used to climb into my lap to read picture books. I thought about the slow rewiring of reality happening around me, the way Molly spoke to me as if I were already in hospice, how Justin averted his eyes during conversations, how the kids barely acknowledged me, how every object I touched in the house seemed to come with a condition. "Please don't touch that, it's decorative. Please don't sit there, it's white linen. Please don't open that cabinet, it's not organized yet. Please remember to knock before entering shared spaces." Shared spaces. That was the phrase Molly used when she started locking the downstairs bathroom after 9 p.m. "It's a shared space," she said. "We need boundaries." I wanted to ask her what exactly I was sharing. My pension, my property, my silence. One afternoon, as I returned from the park, I found Alec and Faith in the kitchen, laughing over their phones. They didn't see me at first. Alec was mimicking my walk, exaggerated and slow, hunching his back, dragging his feet, saying, "Oh, where am I? What year is it?" Faith nearly collapsed with laughter. Then she pulled up a video. I caught a glimpse. It was a grainy clip of me in the garden, bending to pull weeds. Alec had added a voiceover. "When the dementia kicks in, but the lawn still needs love." They'd posted it to some app. Thousands of views. Hundreds of laughing emojis. I backed away before they saw me, walked straight to my room, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I didn't cry. That part of me felt long gone. Instead, I made another list. Names, actions, dates. I kept it in the back of my notebook, along with the deed, and then, Just as I thought they had exhausted their arsenal of microaggressions, they escalated again. I overheard Molly talking on the phone with someone named Janice. "Yes, we're looking into assisted living," she said. "But there are some logistical complications. He doesn't think he needs it, of course. He still thinks he's fine. It's sad, really. He repeats himself constantly. We think it's early onset. But he's so stubborn. He won't see a doctor. We're documenting everything: video, timestamps, medication errors." There was a pause. "Yes, we've been told legal guardianship is the next step. We're working on it." I stared at the floor of the hallway, the grain of the oak panels I had chosen myself, and realized that I was being slowly disappeared. Not physically. That would have been too easy. But legally, administratively, emotionally, I was being erased. They were creating a paper trail of fiction, a manufactured narrative of my decline. Every withheld letter, every intercepted phone call, every tiny humiliation had a purpose: to paint me as unfit to remain in control of the life I had built. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window and watched the street lamps flicker, the shadows stretching across the driveway. I thought of Lorna. I imagined her standing beside me, arms crossed, mouth tight. She wouldn't have tolerated this. She would have called a lawyer the moment Molly changed the pantry lock. She would have said, "Garvey, you're not a guest here. This is your home. Don't let them make you forget that." I wished she were here. I wished she could see me now. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe I was glad she didn't have to witness the slow dismantling of our shared life. In the morning, I began transferring documents to a private file. Not just the deed, but bank records, medical statements, receipts, correspondence. I went to a notary and filed a statement of retained legal capacity. I changed the beneficiary of my life insurance policy. I moved my pension payments to a new account. Quietly, methodically, I began to claw back control, and with every step, every signature, every notarized seal, I felt something return to me. Something I hadn't felt in years. Not rage, not sadness. Ownership. The discovery of the living trust agreement in the attic had ignited a fire inside me that had been smoldering under the weight of years of neglect and humiliation. But it was not until the day I sat across from my old friend and lawyer, Martin, that the full reality of what I was up against settled in with a heavy finality. Martin's office, nestled in a modest brick building downtown, smelled of worn leather and faded legal volumes. As he pulled the deed from the folder, his eyes sharpened in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Garvey," he began carefully, "this document changes everything." For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that was not just wishful thinking, but rooted in law and fact. We went over the details line by line, and it was clear. My rights to the house were not only intact, but legally binding. I was a co-owner with full authority. What that meant in practice, however, was a different matter entirely. Martin cautioned me, Samali, about the complexities of family dynamics intertwined with property law. "Your son and Molly may try to contest this," he said. "They might claim you're not competent, that you don't understand what you're doing. It happens often in cases like this." His words sent a cold wave over me, but they also steeled my resolve. I was not about to be pushed out, not after everything I had built. Not after everything Lorna and I had dreamed of when we laid these bricks with our own hands. The realization that I was no longer just fighting for a place to live, but for my dignity and identity, gave me clarity I had lacked in years. That night, I sat in the dim light of the living room, the shadows cast by the fireplace flickering against the walls that had once been filled with laughter and love. The silence around me was profound, oppressive, but my mind was alive with plans and possibilities. I began cataloging everything: the changes they had made, the doors they had locked, the phone calls they had diverted, and I made notes on how each action had chipped away at my autonomy. I documented the times the grandchildren had laughed at me, the half-truths Molly had told about my health, the whispered conversations behind closed doors. It was painful, but necessary. I understood now that this was no longer just a personal battle. It was a battle against a system of neglect that often goes unnoticed. In the days that followed, I reached out to an elder care advocate, a woman named Rachel, who had been recommended by Martin. Rachel was compassionate, but firm, with a deep understanding of the legal and emotional turmoil many elders face when their families turn against them. She explained the mechanisms of guardianship laws, financial exploitation, and elder abuse, terms I had avoided confronting until now. With her guidance, I started preparing for the inevitable challenges. We spoke at length about gathering evidence, about building a case not just for my ownership, but for the respect and care I deserved. It was overwhelming, but Rachel's presence gave me strength I hadn't felt in years. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the house grew colder, more strained. Justin and Molly were aware now that I had found the documents, and their smiles were tighter, their conversations more guarded. The grandchildren were pulled closer into their sphere of influence, and my presence was reduced to a formality, a background figure in their orchestrated household. I found myself eating alone more often, the dinner table shrinking as if to physically exclude me from their lives. The disconnect was painful, but the discovery of the trust had given me a secret weapon. I was no longer just the elderly man they could dismiss. I was a co-owner, with rights, with a voice that could no longer be silenced. One afternoon, Justin confronted me directly for the first time. He was in the kitchen, loading dishes into the dishwasher with a forced calm. "Dad," he said, not looking at me, "maybe it's time to think about downsizing. You don't need this big house anymore. We can help you find a place that's easier to manage." His words stung, not because of their content, but because of their delivery, patronizing and dismissive, as if I were a child being steered away from a toy I loved. I looked him in the eye and said, "This house is mine as much as it's yours, and I intend to prove it." His face paled, but he said nothing. That evening, I returned to the attic and pulled out an old photo album. The pictures were faded, but the memories were vivid. Lorna's smile, our wedding day, the first Christmas in this very house, the children playing in the yard. I traced the outlines of familiar faces, the handwriting on the back of photos, the small notes tucked between pages. It was a testament not just to ownership, but to life itself. This house was a vessel of decades of love and hope, of sacrifices made and dreams nurtured. And now it was at the center of a storm that threatened to tear everything apart. The middle point of my journey was not marked by a single event, but by the dawning awareness that I was no longer a passive observer in my own life. I was becoming an active participant, a man reclaiming his story piece by piece. The legal documents were not just papers. They were keys unlocking a future where I could assert my rights and demand respect. Yet, with this power came the bitter knowledge that family ties could be as fragile and dangerous as any external threat. The house that once symbolized security and warmth had become a battleground, and I was preparing to fight for every inch. In the quiet moments before sleep, I felt the weight of loneliness and betrayal settle over me. But I also felt something else, a spark of determination, a flicker of hope that had survived years of neglect. The battle ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready. Ready to stand up not just for the house, but for myself, for the legacy of love and life that no one could take away. And so, the middle point was reached. The point where the past and future collided, where the fragile bonds of family were tested, and where the true measure of a man's spirit would be revealed. In the weeks that followed my conversation with Justin, the air in the house thickened with a tension that no one acknowledged, but everyone carried. Like a gas leak we were all pretending not to smell. The children moved through the house on tiptoes, whispering more and glancing at me out of the corners of their eyes, as if waiting for me to drop something or say something forgetful to validate the story Molly and Justin were weaving so carefully. Molly herself became a specter, always watching, rarely speaking directly to me, but leaving signs of her presence everywhere. My laundry, which I had always done myself, started disappearing from the hamper and reappearing, clean but with several items missing. When I asked about my cardigan, the gray one Lorna had knitted me in 2002, Molly said she didn't know what I was talking about, and perhaps I'd misplaced it. A week later, I saw Faith wearing it, sleeves rolled up, laughing with her friend on the front porch. When I opened my mouth to ask for it back, she looked at me with something between pity and disgust and said, "It smells like mothballs. You can have it." I said nothing. I walked back inside and made a note in my journal. It was around that time that they started inviting people over. People I didn't know, friends from Molly's yoga studio or Justin's office, and introducing themselves as the homeowners. I was never mentioned. One evening, I came into the living room to find a group of well-dressed strangers sipping wine and complimenting the renovations. Molly smiled at me, tight-lipped, and said, "Oh, this is Garvey, he's..." Family. A woman with dyed red hair and too many bracelets extended her hand and asked if I lived nearby. Before I could answer, Molly interjected, "He stays with us sometimes. We like to keep an eye on him." The laughter that followed, polite, dismissive, oblivious, rung in my ears like a siren. I went to my room and stayed there for the rest of the evening. When I emerged the next morning, the front door had a new smart lock. My access code no longer worked. Justin told me it was a system update and that he'd give me the new code later. He never did. The full extent of their plan began to come into focus the following Monday, when a manila envelope arrived in the mail addressed to me. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside were legal documents notifying me of an intent to file for durable power of attorney, citing signs of cognitive decline and inability to manage personal affairs. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers trembling, reading the words over and over. They had claimed I was forgetful, that I had repeated stories, that I had gotten lost walking home, none of which was true. They had built a dossier of fiction, carefully curated and framed, to paint me as a man unraveling, all so they could gain legal control over my life. I called Martin immediately, and by the end of the day, we had filed a formal objection. "They're going for guardianship," he said, voice tight with controlled rage. "They're trying to get ahead of you, Garvey. You need to prepare yourself." Over the next 2 weeks, the house became a theater of manipulation. Molly and Justin began to treat me with exaggerated concern in front of the children, in front of their friends, in front of neighbors. "Did you take your meds, Garvey?" Molly would ask loudly, though she knew I didn't take any daily medications. "Do you remember what day it is?" Justin would ask casually during dinner, smirking at Faith. I answered correctly every time, and they would nod solemnly, as if still unconvinced. They were trying to bait me into an outburst. I didn't give it to them. I kept calm, took notes, and continued building my own case. I documented every lie, every insult, every manipulation. I backed up every bank statement, every message, every piece of correspondence that showed I had full cognitive ability. I scheduled an appointment for a comprehensive medical evaluation, including neurological assessments, cognitive testing, and a psychological review. Rachel accompanied me and took detailed notes. The results came back clear. No evidence of dementia, memory loss, or diminished capacity. I filed the report with the court as part of my counterclaim. Molly was furious. I overheard her screaming at Justin behind the locked bedroom door. "We had everything set up. You said he'd fold." Justin tried to calm her, but I could hear the fear creeping into his voice now. Their plan was unraveling, but instead of backing off, they doubled down. A few days later, while I was in the park, Molly called the police. When I returned, 2 officers were waiting on the porch. They said someone had reported a wandering senior in the area who seemed disoriented. They were polite but firm. I handed them my ID, explained I was out for a walk, and pointed to the house. Molly came out, tears in her eyes, and said, "He's been getting worse. Sometimes he forgets where he is." The officers looked at me, then at her, and then back at me. I smiled calmly and said, "Would you like to see my most recent neurological exam? It's notarized." I offered them a copy from my file folder. They declined, but one of them nodded, almost apologetically. "Sorry, sir. Just doing our job." When they left, I turned to Molly and said, "That was your last move. You've just made it easier for the court to see what this is." She didn't respond. The real turning point came a week later. I discovered a hidden email account linked to Justin's name on the family computer in the study, a shared machine I had built myself a decade ago. He had left it logged in. There, I found correspondence with a senior living facility in New Jersey, along with financial estimates and notes labeled Dad's Pension, Transfer of Assets, and Residence Change Prep. The date they were planning to move me was 2 weeks away. I printed everything. I handed it to Martin the next morning. "That's attempted coercions," he said, "and possibly fraud." We filed for an injunction. The court set a date for a formal hearing to determine whether Justin and Molly had engaged in elder abuse and financial exploitation. When the papers were served, Molly screamed at the courier and slammed the door in his face. That night, she came to my room uninvited. "You think you're clever?" she hissed. "You think you're going to win?" I didn't answer. I turned to the window and stared at the darkness. She waited for a response. When she realized none was coming, she added, "You don't deserve this house." I turned back to her finally and said, "Neither do you." In the days leading up to the hearing, Justin tried to reach out. He brought me coffee one morning, black, no sugar, just how I liked it. He sat across from me in the sunroom and said, "Dad, this has gotten out of hand. Maybe we can make a deal." I waited. "We walk away," he said. "You keep the house. We'll move out. No court, no mess." I looked at him for a long moment. "And in return, you don't pursue charges. You let it go." I considered his offer. Then I said, "No. You don't get to spend a year trying to erase me and then ask for forgiveness when the ink won't dry. This is going to court, and I'll be there in a suit you tried to throw away, walking upright with every document in place. You won't take anything else from me." He left without another word. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. I wore my old navy blue blazer, the one Lorna said made me look distinguished, and I combed my hair back, just the way she used to do before parent-teacher nights. Martin picked me up. The courtroom was small, but full. Rachel was there, along with a few neighbors I hadn't seen in months, and even Charles and his wife, who gave me a thumbs up from the gallery. Justin and Molly sat on the opposite side, flanked by their lawyer, whose face was set in stone. The judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes, listened carefully as both sides presented their arguments. I spoke clearly, calmly, referencing the documents, the evaluations, the recordings. I told the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. When it was over, the judge took only a few minutes to deliver her ruling. The attempt to gain guardianship was denied. The durable power of attorney filing was declared invalid due to lack of evidence. The judge recommended the initiation of an investigation into potential financial abuse. Molly looked like she might faint. Justin stared at the floor. I felt nothing. No triumph, no joy, just release. That night, I stood in the backyard under the stars and breathed deeply. The house behind me was quiet. I knew the silence wouldn't last. They would lash out again. But I was ready now. No longer alone. No longer invisible. They had tried to write me out of my life. I had written myself back in, and this time my name was in bold. In the days following the court hearing, the energy in the house shifted yet again. Not like a tide pulling back, but like the eye of a storm, quiet, deceptive, heavy with unspoken rage. Justin and Molly didn't speak to me directly, didn't shout, didn't protest, but they moved around me with a deliberate chill. Their footsteps clipped, their voices low, their glances filled with something almost feral. They had lost the legal battle, yes, but not their hunger to reclaim power, and I could see it in the way Molly started slamming drawers louder than necessary, or how Justin left the front door unlocked overnight, as if daring something to happen. The tension built day by day, and I kept to myself, spending most of my time in my room, quietly finalizing the next step I had been contemplating for weeks. Not just reclaiming my rights, but removing them, my son and his wife, from the house. Entirely, they had made it clear that no truce was possible, that peace would only ever be a facade behind which new schemes brewed. I had no interest in war, but I also refused to live in occupied territory. I met with Martin again, this time not in his office, but at the local coffee shop down the street from the courthouse. I wanted the conversation to be away from files and law books, away from the air that smelled like bureaucracy. I told him I was ready to initiate a motion to dissolve the shared ownership. "You want to push for full sale?" he asked. I nodded. "Let the court force the liquidation. I want out. But more importantly, I want them out." Martin leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "You know it won't be quick," he said. "They'll delay it, challenge it, stall as long as they can." I nodded again. "Let them try. Every month they drag it out is another month they live knowing I hold the matchbook." Within the week, the paperwork was filed. A petition to dissolve joint ownership and initiate forced sale of the house was submitted to the county clerk. Martin made sure to serve them directly at home. He wanted them to see the envelope land in their hands, to feel the weight of it. What I didn't expect then was the level of venom they unleashed afterward. Not in court, but in life. Justin began parking his car across the driveway so I couldn't leave. When I said nothing, he stopped speaking to me altogether and started playing music loudly at night, a loop of ambient techno that seemed designed specifically to disrupt sleep. Molly began throwing away things from my room, quietly, stealthily. A book would vanish, a pair of socks, a small framed picture of Lorna that sat on my bedside table. When I confronted her, she claimed she'd never touched anything. "Maybe you're losing things, Garvey," she said, smiling with her mouth but not her eyes. "It happens." I called the locksmith and had the lock on my door changed. I gave no explanation. One night after I came home from the pharmacy, I found my bed stripped of all bedding. No sheets, no blankets, no pillow. In their place was a folded note, "Cleaned for your comfort." I stood in the doorway holding that slip of paper and knew exactly what it meant. I went out and bought a sleeping bag. I said nothing. I made tea and went to bed inside a nylon shell on a bare mattress, and I wrote in my journal, "They are trying to make me leave. I will not." The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, I kept my distance. I communicated through legal channels only, and when Molly sent me text messages saying things like, "Do you really want to do this to your family?" or "You're going to die alone in some apartment, Garvey. We were your last chance," I saved them, screenshot them, forwarded them to Martin. Every cruel word became another brick in the wall I was building between myself and them, a barrier that would finally sever our toxic entanglement. The week of the hearing, a realtor named Corinne Page visited the house for a preliminary valuation. She was polite, professional, and did not flinch when Molly hissed at her in the entryway. "You're wasting your time." "We're not selling." Corinne smiled and said, "That will be up to the court." She walked the property with me, taking notes. When we reached the backyard, I told her about the oak tree, the one Lorna had planted from a sapling, the one under which we had buried Scout, our dog, the one that had shaded so many childhood picnics. Corinne listened with the kind of quiet respect that had become foreign to me in recent years. When she left, she handed me her card and said, "I've seen this before. You're doing the right thing. Sometimes letting go is the only way to hold on to yourself." The final hearing came on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom was overcast, the sky outside a dull steel that matched the cold hush inside the chambers. The judge reviewed our petition, heard both arguments, examined the documentation. Molly tried to speak about the inconvenience, about the supposed betrayal of a father turning on his family. But the judge silenced her gently but firmly. "This isn't about feelings," she said. "This is about property law and elder protections. Mr. Ellis has every legal right to pursue a dissolution of ownership. The court sees no evidence that would prohibit this." The ruling was delivered quickly, with a directness that left Molly stunned. The property would be listed. They would have 60 days to vacate, or the court would issue a mandatory eviction. The judge also authorized a financial audit into previous account activity to ensure there had been no inappropriate transfers. Justin's face was pale when we left. He didn't look at me. Molly did. Her glare was fire. I returned home that evening to find the kitchen trashed. Plates broken, food spilled, the refrigerator door left wide open. I didn't react. I took photos. I forwarded them to Martin. Then I made myself a sandwich with what was left of the bread and sat in the living room, my living room, and ate while staring at the fireplace I had built with my own hands. That night I heard them arguing behind their door. I heard the word homeless. I heard credit score. I heard lawsuit. I went to sleep early and deeply. The next morning, Molly approached me in the hallway. Her expression had changed. It wasn't anger now. It was desperation poorly disguised as concern. "Garvey," she said, "we've all made mistakes, but surely we can work something out. Maybe we pay you rent. You don't really want to live alone at your age. Think about your health. Your grandchildren." I said nothing. I simply walked past her, into the kitchen, poured myself coffee, and returned to my room. 3 days later, they moved out. No fanfare, no goodbyes, just the thud of boxes and the scrape of furniture across the floors. I stayed in my room until the moving truck left. When the silence came, it was absolute. And it was beautiful. I walked through the house slowly. Every room was empty of their presence, their scent, their tension, their contempt. It was all gone. I opened every window. I let the air in. That night I slept under Lorna's quilt, the one Molly had hidden in the linen closet for years. I found it still smelling faintly of cedar and lavender. And for the first time in a long, long time, I slept without dreams. In the weeks that followed their departure, the house grew quieter in a way that no longer felt oppressive, but restorative, like a body finally exhaling after years of bracing against constant tension. The rooms that once echoed with confrontation and passive aggression became still, but not empty. There was a different kind of presence now, one I recognized, one that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. It was Lorna. It was me. It was the original pulse of this house, before it was reduced to a battleground. I moved slowly at first, reacquainting myself with forgotten corners. I reopened the parlor and restored the music cabinet. I dug out the boxes in the attic and hung back the paintings Molly had declared dated. I returned my books to the living room shelves, and I sat down in my old chair and read in peace, the late afternoon sun spilling through the windows just as it used to. My days became simple, structured by my own rhythm. I cooked modest meals, real food, not nutritional portions, and took long walks again, not to escape, but to observe, to breathe, to nod at familiar neighbors. Some of them had heard fragments of the story, some had stayed quiet, but one by one, they began to return. Charles stopped by with a small peach cobbler from his wife. Mrs. Reyes brought me clippings for the garden. Even the mailman, who had once been instructed to deliver all envelopes directly to Justin, shook my hand and said, "Glad to see you back where you belong, Mr. Ellis." I felt like a man slowly stitching his name back into the seams of his life, not as a protest, but as an affirmation. I made one final visit to the courthouse to finalize the audit. The investigator assigned to the case confirmed what I already suspected. Molly had siphoned a portion of my pension each month into a shared household account, and then used it for personal expenses, spa treatments, boutique purchases, even a weekend retreat at a so-called wellness resort. The court sanctioned her with a repayment plan. I declined to pursue criminal charges. When the investigator asked me why, I simply said, "Because I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I just want my name to mean something again." She nodded slowly and said, "That's rare." I received one letter from Justin after they left, typed, short, unsigned. He said he didn't agree with what I did, but hoped I found peace. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done. I read it once and filed it away. The grandchildren never wrote. I didn't expect them to. They were teenagers, shaped by the stories their parents fed them. Maybe, one day, they'd ask questions. Maybe they wouldn't. That would be their journey. I had no more illusions to protect. In late spring, I hired a local painter to restore the trim on the front porch. As he worked, I stood beneath the oak tree Lorna had planted and watched the breeze stir its branches. The sunlight flickered through its canopy like a memory not quite fully formed. I thought of Lorna's hands in the soil, her laughter when the wind blew her hat away, her quiet pride the day she saw the first acorn fall. I placed a small bench under that tree and sat there every morning, tea in hand, letting the silence return not as absence, but as presence. That, I realized, was the difference. This wasn't solitude. This was reclamation. The house no longer whispered fear. It breathed again. The walls no longer listened for insults. They held space for thought. I didn't need to repaint everything or erase the scars. The point wasn't to pretend the damage had never occurred. It was to live fully within the truth of what remained. I began teaching again in a way, hosting small gatherings of retired teachers, leading free discussions at the library, mentoring a young man from the neighborhood who wanted to become a history teacher. My voice had never stopped working. It had only been silenced. Now, it rang out again, clear and strong. Not because I demanded to be heard, but because I finally had room to speak. Sometimes at night I still hear echoes, Molly's clipped tones, Justin's hollow sighs, even Faith's mocking laugh, but they don't haunt me. They remind me. They remind me of how easy it is to surrender yourself by inches, by letting others rewrite your story line by line. And they remind me that I didn't let it happen forever. I stopped it. I found the line, stood on it, and said, "No more." The hardest part was not confronting them. It was confronting myself. The part of me that had allowed it all to unfold for so long out of hope, out of a misplaced belief in family loyalty. But now, standing alone in the very house they tried to erase me from, I feel no shame. I feel clean. I feel honest. I am 76 years old. I am not infirm. I am not confused. And I am not gone. I am here. This is my home. And for as long as I can rise each morning, it will remain so. Lorna would have smiled at that.